Our next speaker is Bill Softky. He has a Ph.D. in physics from Caltech, and now he lives in Silicon Valley and works in brain science. Is that correct? Yep. Here he is.
Hi there. I'd like to move this over so I can look at my notes and not have to remember anything. So let's get the first slide. I'm calling it 7 Truths About the Brain. And truth is a word you very, very rarely hear scientists use. We're much more careful than that, so I'd like to give you a couple minutes of why I feel entitled to it and how it's really one of the last few places in science you're going to get a word like that, if you know where to look for it. It's really fun for me to be here among visionaries, and every single one of the last few talks was triggering something related to this. And I think we're all converging on the same place. But I'm especially happy because everybody seems to love science. And granted, my career has been mostly neuroscience, computational neuroscience, tech, algorithms, online advertising, a bunch of other stuff, not physics. But I'm actually a physicist. Both my parents were physicists, and at some point they both had licenses to run nuclear reactors. So I grew up deep, deep, deep in the sort of the physics view of science, not just any old science. And the kinds of stories we tell and the sorts of things we think are important are a little bit different than in other parts of science, because we have not just one, but 2 kinds of theory kicking around. So most of what you know of science is experiments. Somebody did something in a lab and they recorded the measurements and the anesthetics and whatever else was going on, and they wrote this stuff down and it got published, and now that's a record, and then there are more. So you gather records of stuff people did under certain circumstances, and that's a basis of facts, and ultimately we call that experimental science, and that's how we validate stuff. Then there are the theorists, the math geek guys and programmers, who go into the lab, and they do the data analysis, and they're the ones who make it mathematically solid, and fit the lines and gather the curves and find the averages, and distill things into a nice simple model. But then, and this is where physicists are sort of different from other disciplines, there's a sort of mathematical cleanup crew. The ones who aren't working on any particular experiment, they don't even do experiments. They kind of sit in the back and look at different experiments and wonder whether everything fits together right. People like Einstein. He was looking at how waves propagate and realized electromagnetism just didn't work unless you had this thing called the velocity of light. It's just a basic conceptual consistency. It's sort of like 2 + 2 = 4. He made sure the concepts lined up, discovered something, and it was true in a very deep sense. It couldn't have been otherwise. Our understanding of how atoms and molecules bounce around and make pressure and temperature, same thing. That's rooted in the only way it could possibly be for little things binging around in 3 dimensions. There was a guy who predicted the existence of neutrinos by looking at these tracks and saying, a particle moved here and then it moved here, which meant it needed to push off something invisible. So he predicted the existence of an invisible particle nobody'd ever imagined, and there it was. So every now and then there are things where the conceptual nature, the mathematical nature, tell you that something is true, even though a million scientists might take 20 or 30 or 40 years to discover it. So sometimes there's truths which are so deep and so durable, they just have to be that way. And those are the ones I'm going to talk about. So let's see, make sure I got through those things. So basically we're going to try to be on bedrock, the kind of stuff that even if society doesn't like the message, even if it's weird or economically or politically annoying or confrontational, these are supposed to be buried so deeply that you can't possibly contest them. So we're going to start with what the brain does. And before I get to telling you what it does, really, I think since each one of you has one, we can check it. So just for a moment, pinch yourself, look around, notice the world around you, how much detail, how many megapixels, whatever your retinal and somatic display. Just do something to remind yourself where you are, okay? What you see here is a simulation. You're looking at your own internal retina display in your brain. The real world exists, all right, and I'm in it, I promise you. But what you see of me is whatever pixelated or unpixelated version exists in your brain, reconstructed from sound waves and cell firings coming out of your eye. The information flow there is about like 1 million raindrops a second. So you imagine a pond with 1 million raindrops a second. That's the information from which you construct everything you've ever seen. This is a really good computational job. We don't have simulators which can do that. We don't even know how to design simulators which can do that. But that's what it is. So next slide, please. So the first thing about the brain is brains are 3D processors. It's mathematically essential that what we are doing right now, this minute, and every minute of our lives is three-dimensional reconstruction of sensory input. That's a very difficult technology to make. No one else does it. We don't know how to do it. But we're obviously doing it. Okay, that's number one. I'll get into that in a bit. These are the other ones we'll get to about how slow and coarse thinking is, including everything you've ever remembered. The fact that mind reading is basically impossible. The fact that tech is in a very specific sense bad for us. The fact that our instincts are actually good for us to calibrate ourselves, our sensory motor systems. The fact that a lot of the stuff that is considered, especially around Oakland and Berkeley, woo-woo, is actually solid scientific reality. Things like vibrations and energy. I'll get into that, because physicists don't toss around the word energy easily. And the fact that humans really need proximity, which is make things like this fun. So, on to the next. Oh, so? Yes, that's good. Next one. Next slide, please. I don't know if you can see those tiny little dotted lines going from the man up to the brain and then curving back to that funny little boxes on the side. But the first point here, I don't have time to support them with experiment or why essentially the conceptual landscape says these things are true. But first and foremost, brains are designed to control bodies. We are mammals, we are primates, they're mammals. For 20, 30, 40 million years, there have been mammals running bodies in 3 dimensions. That's the only thing every mammal brain on Earth has done, is run a body. So that's got to be the number one thing for a brain in general. And if humans think it's something else, we're kind of got a little hubris there. So it's a 3D simulator to repopulate the world. It's a 3D controller to figure out where your body is in space. I mean, a bunch of nerves are firing in here, and somehow I know where my arm is. It's actually a really hard problem if you try to solve it. But we solve it by calibrating. Babies move around, they try random stuff, they slowly discover which motions work and which don't work. Same with your eyes. You put together your visual world and you learn to see better. So before you get into reading or talking or any of those human things, just moving around is a really tough data gathering problem. And it doesn't require memory. The process of controlling a body is 100% real-time, in-the-moment flow. You literally cannot remember, a few milliseconds ago in that mode. So I'm not saying that's all that humans do, but that is what a brain is supposed to do. And we'll have to then look at what humans do on top of that. Okay, so in the 3D version, the brain is basically a bunch of little building blocks, each one of which is trying to run a finger joint or an elbow joint or maybe a whole body curve or move your eyes around or something. It's all basically sending out motor signals, gathering sensory signals back in, trying to figure out what happened, rinse and repeat. That's basically what our hardware does. So now let's drill in a little farther, because I'm going to get more and more specific as we go through. Okay, next please. So this is a view of human communication. I think you can see all of it here. So just look on the left side, the kind of output we have as creatures. Imagine you as a robot. I'm actually thinking of writing an article called Giant Robot Theory, just analyzing the human being as if we were just a bunch of struts and cables. But what you've got are various kinds of outputs. There's a whole bunch of muscles, very subtle ones on the face, a whole bunch of ones around the neck. Unlike other primates, the entire abdomen is visible on humans. We don't even have hair covering it up very much. The limbs move a lot more. Mammals can wave or hominids can wave our arms around all the time. Most other animals can't. So there's a lot of different ways our motor outputs send information. And there's a bunch of ways of calculating how much. The simplest one is to ask how much Cisco uses to send high-definition telepresence. So that's a flat image of a face only, and that takes 4 megabytes a second. So that's probably a good proxy for how much information overall a human body sends out. Even though that's just a space, it's only 2 dimensions, it's only pixels, it's got a low frame rate. And there's a lot of other information we send which is only visible in strange ripples or sometimes internal or in a vocal tremor. If I'm nervous, you can hear that in my voice because that's coming from the deep abdomen. So that's what's coming out. A bunch of information from the face, from the visible motion of the muscles, from the position of the limbs, And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. That's how it divides out. Voice, by the way, is not very much of it. And that goes over to other people. So for instance, I might be having abdominal tremor and you're hearing it in my voice. So it's going out of here and into your ears. A bunch of stuff, I'm moving my arms, that goes into your eyes, etc. But ultimately, it can all get to another person. And if you're close enough to them, it's all flying back and forth at once. So you're basically looking at overall megabits per second from one person into another. Compare that to what we call communication. Words, for instance. Words are 25 bits per second. That's how much information is in spoken English. If you were to transcribe what I'm saying, you get 25 bits per second, and you've thrown away megabits per second. This is the problem with technology, among other things. We are designed for incredibly high bandwidth, zero latency, high reciprocity communication. In signal processing terms, this is fantastic. Okay, next please. The second conclusion, thinking is coarse and slow. We talk about our abstract thoughts and our memories and our concepts of what we are and who we are, all sorts of things which can land in words or categories. But anything which can sit still, your name, your image of what happened, your memory of an event, it takes at least a quarter second to gel that in place. The conceptual parts of our brains run at a few cycles a second. That's about how fast you can remember any sequence of thoughts, right? And by the end of the hour, you've probably forgotten most of those. So long-term memory goes way, way, way down. It's only, even short-term memory is a few per second, and there's only a few channels there. So that's sort of the top level. It's corresponding to the firing rates of neurons or activations of cortical areas or something like that. If you look what's actually happening inside the brain, the information it chooses to send from place to place, it's 10 billion of those at under a millisecond resolution each. The information ratio is at least a millionfold, maybe a billionfold. At some point, we can stop arguing about it. There is just so much more speed and density in our subconscious processing than in anything we can possibly remember. Whatever we call abstraction is basically just a hack built on top of the vast majority of cool, fast, subtle stuff we're literally not aware of. Okay. Third slide, please. Or third one. Okay. This truth is no mind reading. And I keep hearing about people who think, or science fiction stories, which think that our consciousness can be copied or something like that. So it's time for a reality check. Up there is the best microelectrode array. It's known as the Utah array. It's got little silicone spires on about a 10 by 10 grid. They're about half a millimeter apart, a couple millimeters long. If you can see down here in sort of the purple thing, each one has several different electrical contacts on it. So a research group like the ones over at Stanford, where I sometimes get to see them play with stuff, can push that into the brain of, say, a primate or a mouse or something, and those electrodes will work their way through the neurons and record some of them. So this is way better than any kind of stuff on the outside of the skull. This is literally not just the best that current technology can record from neurons, but given that neurons are this three-dimensional mash, and you actually have to poke this stupid little wool curry comb through it and kind of break them up, it's obvious you can't really stick in one electrode per neuron, right? You're going to undersample them a bit. And that's up there. I've drawn a little neuron. That's if neurons are doing the talking. There are incredibly powerful reasons to believe. In fact, this is why I'm calling it truth, even though there are very few people who really thought through this truth thoroughly. But there are incredibly good reasons to believe that what's really happening to do the three-dimensional part is actually a little tiny three-dimensional nanoscopic computation sort of inside the neurons, in the funny little elastic mesh there. But whether you believe it's there or not, we clearly do three-dimensional computation, and there is clearly a computational level, at least at the level of dendritic spines, which are of order a tenth or a hundredth of a micron wide. And that means the really important stuff is not that neuron, it's these tiny, tiny, tiny little cells which are, a thousandth the width of a neuron. So if, on the next slide, please, we just sort of line those up. There, the big beam there is the purple electrode, and you can see one of those yellow electrodes. I've scattered a bunch of neurons at about the right size over it, and then that little cloud of tiny little dots, which looks like a galaxy, imagine one of those tiny dots is the real voxel, the real volume element the brain is computing with, and imagine how many of those voxels, what fraction of those actually get recorded by the plates? Or more rather, how is the energy from one of those little voxels doing something going to make any impact on a giant chunk of metal 1,000,000 times bigger than itself? Can't do it. The metal's too big. It's like a transistor. Transistors are so small you can't actually record from them anymore, believe it or not. So very good computation is much tinier and more subtle than anything we can ever record. And what this means is that electrodes will always miss what our brains are doing. It will never be recorded except by our muscles. It can't even really record it itself. There are fundamental physical reasons why what goes on in our heads is mostly going to stay there. Next slide, please. Now, the problem with technology, and this is something I think we'll recognize a little bit more, is that on the left side of this familiar graph is the output we're accustomed to, is that's the output we're making. But if instead of going through 3-space, or maybe through a little bit of an amplifier, if instead it goes through a camera at a distance in bad light at a low frame rate and a small number of pixels and a bad internet connection and comes off on a glary screen that you're looking at and other people are distracting you, that is a reduction in information. You can calculate how much. For example, Skype takes about 100 kilobits a second, which is maybe 3% of what's coming off your face. And when it shows up, it's still on a flat screen with low contrast and stuff like that. So it's not like all of those 100 kilobits are actually getting into your eye in the proper form. In fact, most mammals aren't even capable of perceiving 3 dimensions from a screen. I remember my cat was looking at his owner, my daughter's face on a screen on Skype and could not recognize it. Held the cat right here. Pixels are just like dappled shadows on the ground. So Skype is not communication, and Skype's the best of them. A cell phone really only takes about 1,000 bytes per second to be able to do an audible job, which is all they really pay for because it costs them to spend money for bandwidth. So cell coverage is really bad. Lots of dropped calls, lots of garbling, the underwater and stuff. But the more you compress out any kind of communication, be it Skype or audio, the less information is there. That's what compression means. It means throwing away information. Unfortunately, that's the information, like vocal texture, like background noise, like pauses, like little tiny tremors you might think of. All that stuff is what we use to decide to trust people or not. And so the more of that metadata we throw away, the more we basically cross our fingers and hope it's not a robot on the other end. And I have been fooled by telemarketing robots. I spent a minute talking to, "Hi, I'm Adam. I'm with the home security company." "Are you really a person?" "Ha ha ha, we're not here to talk about me. Let's talk about home security." You get the idea, right? There are machines out there which can fool people over the phone, including people who've done machine learning research. It's really scary. So the lesson from this, oh, by the way, text. How much bandwidth is there texting? A byte or so per second? We're down millions-fold from our original bandwidth capacities. So the general rule from this is any time text stands between you and anything, it's probably causing problems, first on the bandwidth end and then on the bias end. It's like the internet. Somebody paid for it to be there, and they might not have your interests at heart. So the content, just as tech is stripping away the metadata we need to trust things, it's also biasing the things it's telling us, so it's harder for us to tell whether it's true. So the nature of technological intermediation, of putting screens between human beings, is, I think, one of the biggest problems we face, and it's probably one of the causes of a lot of our social ills. It really alienates people in a visceral, informational way. It's like a solitary confinement, except you don't know it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, calibration. We're back to being motor beings whose bodies are just moving around in space. If you break down computationally what it really means to control a body, if you sort of write out the software plan for running this whole thing, you find the most efficient way to run it, which in fact is the way it does run, according to the anatomy books, is not by running one muscle at a time, but by figuring out how to stretch the muscle from here to here to here to here, and get them all lined up and vibrating together so the vibrations travel along them, and the whole thing rings like a piano wire from one end to the other. It's by far the best mechanical way to run it. It's clearly how human beings run, and it requires a lot of learning, because you need to gather the data to figure out which muscle to fire when and which motor neuron to fire when. And when you start off learning that, you don't have much data. Babies are kind of clumsy. And sometimes the version of moving around that a baby uses at first, or that someone else uses at first, isn't the perfect one. And yet after practice, it gets kind of stuck in place. And so I've sort of illustrated that. You can have something which at a gross level is really nice, but once you gather enough data to realize, you realize it sort of twisted itself in a knot somewhere, and the knot doesn't want to come out. And this is not a physical knot. It's not like your actual muscle wraps around another muscle. It's that your control software thinks it does. So the control software is always having these things pull against each other and is misinterpreting some of the data. So a lot of what we old people think of as adhesions and knots and kinks in our back and our neck and our hips and stuff is software. I run this by a lot of somatic professionals. It really does look like it's software all the way down. So if you want body work, think of it as data gathering, or think of personal training as data gathering. You're just gathering more information. What does this muscle feel like under this tension, this load, this velocity? Your body is figuring out how to do it better. So we do this automatically. It's what feels good. If given a chance to just exercise or run around, not because we're told we have to get a certain amount of cardio, but just because it feels good, people generally, what feels good is good for them. That's a general principle of moving around and learning stuff. The problem is that since society has made us sit down for so much of the day and not pay attention to subtle movement or grace or efficiency of walking for most of the day, there are large parts of our body which literally people aren't aware of the muscles in. Anyone from Pilates or yoga or a discipline like that will tell you about the sensory motor dark space in the pelvis, where there are about 20 different variables down here, from hip joint position, urogenital control, lower spine, pelvic angle, all kinds of junk going on. It's all tangled, and most Westerners have it messed up. So not only do we have this hard body control problem to solve, but society has almost deliberately made sure we haven't solved it. We have spent far less time arranging our bodies than we need, and that's the source of a lot of unhappiness. But it all comes down to motor control. This is all just a mechanical, computational problem. I don't think there's going to be much debate about this part. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a fun one. This is the East Bay, my favorite rallying cry to the East Bay. What's normally called woo-woo, kind of crystals and energy work and stuff. Well, not the crystals maybe, but what's called energy is taking advantage of the fact we have visualization software. When you look around the world, it looks real and sunlight and stuff like that. But the same software is capable of lighting up little bolts of lightning inside your fingertips. Why not? Nothing outside to say it isn't there. And so if it feels like something, you can visualize it in your body. You can even visualize it, if you feel like, as an aura around someone else. The fact that we're running visualization hardware anyway, so maybe a lot of this energy stuff is real, insofar as it exists in the mind. It's not like out there in the outside world. But the other pieces are kind of more philosophical. For example, body control, as I said, has no memory involved. It's all millisecond level balance, megabits per second of control information. That's the present moment, if you ever heard of it. It hasn't had any future, it doesn't have any past beyond like a tiny fraction of a second in whatever direction you're moving. And so that is what your nervous system, first and foremost, was designed to do. It was also designed to pay much more attention to how things feel than to how we think about them, clearly, because most mammals are spending most of their time feeling, and even we ought to. But there are also things like vibrations. The woo-woo concept of vibrations is actually real. When I showed you that graph of people, with those giant flows of bandwidth, that's a lot of it vibratory. My hand on your shoulder does a certain bone-to-bone shaking, which takes my skeletal system and synchronizes it to yours. Same thing with caressing. There's a particular pattern of vibrations starting in the skin contact, which goes into both people simultaneously. Exactly the same sound waves are traveling into the skin. So vibrations carry massive amounts of information. Plain old physical back and forth vibrations. Not woo-woo tantric energy crystal things, but real plain old moving mass. Postures matter. It turns out bipeds stand upright. It's hard to stand upright. It takes a lot of calibration data. Our ancestors somehow figured out how to practice it. But because they learned that, they learned other postures, display postures, attention-getting things, semaphores, cowering, fear, whatever. But the postures we were born with actually have a tight linkage to our emotional health. And what the yoga people are saying about standing up in different ways or sitting down in different ways Maybe not all of it's real, but the basic idea is absolutely real. Posture and body motion is tightly linked to our emotional health, far more than any kind of tech I've ever heard of, or rather positive emotional health. Okay, and I think we're down to one more, final one. And the final one is that, my answer to what we do is humans need proximity. We need people to be as visible and close to other people as possible with as little tech in between them as possible. That's what we were born for, and that's probably the only thing which is going to make us healthy again. Thanks.
So we've got time for